Welcome to Butterfly, the Becoming. Here, we honor the human experience, its questions, its clarity, and its becoming. You are invited to arrive as you are. I have lived through enough in one lifetime to understand how a belief can quietly take shape without ever being formally introduced, and how that belief can begin to organize the way a person interprets everything that happens to them long before they have paused to consider where it came from or whether it was ever chosen. What I came to believe without ever sitting down and choosing it was that my life had been marked in a way I could feel but could not yet define, as if the level of difficulty I encountered was not incidental, but followed a pattern that had already begun shaping me before I had the language to question it. This was not a dramatic conclusion that I reached in a single moment. And it was not something I spoke out loud to other people for validation. It formed gradually through repetition, through patterns that did not seem to break, and through experiences that required a level of strength I did not yet have, but somehow had to develop in order to continue. When hardship appears once or twice, it can be explained as circumstance. When it continues, when it meets you early, and when it shapes the way you learn to move through the world, it begins to feel less like something that is happening and more like a structure that has already been set in place. And that distinction matters because once something feels structured, you stop interpreting it and begin moving with it as though it was fixed. You begin to accommodate it in ways that are almost invisible to you at first, adjusting your expectations without announcing the change, developing endurance, not because you set out to become strong, but because strength becomes the only way to remain present inside what continues to appear. Over time, that way of living begins to feel like normalcy, when in reality, it may only be adaptation that has gone unquestioned for too long. I did not see that clearly then. What I saw was a life that required resilience, and I met that requirement the only way I knew how, by continuing, by adjusting, and by finding ways to remain present inside situations that were asking more of me than they were giving. There were moments, even in ordinary settings, where I was carrying more than I had the space to process. Yet, I did not pause to ask whether what I was holding belonged to me. I only focused on how to carry it with more control, more quiet, and less visible strain. At the time, that felt responsible. It felt necessary. It felt like association. But there is a difference between learning how to carry what is in front of you and recognizing when you have been carrying something beyond the point where it should have remained yours. If you stay aware long enough, there comes a point where something begins to separate inside your understanding. And although it does not arrive loudly or with instructions, it carries a clarity that is difficult to ignore once seen. It recognizes that there is a difference between what you have lived through and what you are continuing to live inside. That recognition does not erase anything I had experienced, and it did not suddenly make my life easier, but it did remove something that had been sitting underneath everything I did. The quiet agreement that this level of difficulty was simply the structure of my life. And once that agreement is seen, it becomes difficult to continue honoring it in the same way because it no longer feels like truth. It feels like something that was learned and left unexamined. If I am honest, what I had accepted as purpose was in part an attempt to make sense of what did not make sense, a way to give meaning to experiences that felt excessive and to organize them into something that could be understood instead of something that simply had to be endured. But meaning, when it is built only from what hurts, does not always free you. Sometimes it keeps you connected to the very pattern you are trying to move beyond because it continues to center your life around what was difficult instead of what is now possible. There were moments in my life that did not align with the belief I had been carrying. Moments where I remained when I should not have been able to remain in the way that I did, and where something steadied me before I had the strength to steady myself. It did not arrive with explanation, and it did not change the condition immediately, but it sustained me in a way that made it possible to continue without becoming lost inside what I was experiencing. That is a different kind of presence, one that does not assign hardship, but meets you within it, strengthening you through it, and quietly holds you in place until you are able to stand differently on your own. And once that is understood, it becomes more difficult to continue believing that hardship itself is the identity you are meant to live inside. If what I lived through was not something assigned for me to recreate, then it is not my identity, and it is not my obligation to continue organizing my life around it, especially as it has become clear over time and not forced that the life I am being led into is not meant to be built for survival alone. That realization carries responsibility because it removes the explanation I had been using to justify what I was continuing to allow. And it requires a level of honesty that does not look backward for answers, but looks directly at what is present now. It asks whether what is in front of you is still true, whether it is still necessary, and whether it reflects the life you are now capable of building with the awareness you have gained. I have already proven that I can survive what I was given, and that is no longer the question in front of me. The question now is whether I am willing to live in a way that is no longer organized around survival, and whether I can allow my life to be shaped by something other than the expectation created by what I have already experienced. That is not dramatic shift. It is a precise one, and it begins in the quiet recognition that what was endured does not have to become what is continued. And once that becomes clear, even if nothing changes immediately, you no longer move the same way inside your life because you are no longer confusing what you endured with what you are here to continue. That is the power of butterfly, the becoming.